Okay, first up, thank you everyone for joining us today. We are hearing on our second part of our six-part series of our grant seeking and support, building a prospective funder pipeline, which is presented in partnership today with GrantsPlus. So we're very grateful for our partnership with the team at GrantsPlus. Matt Carter and Kari Mirkin are both senior advisors with GrantsPlus, and will be presenting today's webinar. If you didn't get a chance to join us for the first webinar, we strongly encourage you to go back and watch that because this all is very important information, and we will do some building upon each session. This recording also, as you can see, will be available through the website as well. So we will be recording today's webinar and having that available for any other participants. On the next screen, just tell you quickly about who we are. I'm Maggie Martinelli, and I'm the VP of Administration and Operations at the Scranton Area Community Foundation. And our capacity building arm is the Center for Community Leadership and Nonprofit Excellence. So really briefly, again, this is a kind of a little bit of a repeat of information if you were attending at the first webinar, so I'm just going to kind of breeze through this. But we're the Community Foundation 501c3 public charity for Lackawanna County, but we do believe that our Center for Community Leadership and Nonprofit Excellence serves the larger region. We have assets more than $55 million. We administer more than 250 charitable funds. We do some foundation management services, and we lead a number of other initiatives, including what we deem the center. And the center, as we mentioned, it's a capacity building arm. That we do this to help ensure that our nonprofit partners, that you all are able to meet your critical missions more effectively, in the hopes that you are able to improve your impact throughout our region. So the more effectively that you all are operating, the more effective our whole region is, which is great for us as grant makers and conveners to make sure that you all are doing the best to your ability. So that's why we want to support your capacity and your ability to go out there and do great things, and particularly through this webinar series, your ability to go out and do grant seeking beyond the Scranton Area Community Foundation or even beyond our region. So we want to be able to help you in these efforts. I think that's the only two slides for us. Okay.
Great. Well, we can take over then.
Yeah, so I do want to just say thank you so much to Matt and Kari and the entire team at GrantsPlus. This has been a wonderful partnership. They are going to have some really great resources, not only shared throughout this webinar, but also coaching sessions that they're going to talk a little bit more about, that you can receive some complimentary one-on-one coaching opportunities. So we encourage you to take advantage of that, and just want to offer our sincere thanks to the GrantsPlus team for helping to facilitate these webinar sessions.
Great, thank you. So Maggie, thank you for the intro. And like Maggie said, I'll kick off here. I'm Matt Carter. Kari can introduce herself in a moment. And I first have to apologize. I am in Indianapolis at the Association of Fundraising Professionals Leadership Conference. And in my lovely void of a hotel room here, I can either have the window shining light on my face so you can see my face, and then have a giant mirror so you can see my screen as I'm talking in reverse, or I could be against the wall and have sort of terrible videos. So those are the choices we have to go with, unfortunately. So I apologize for that. But a little bit about GrantsPlus. So GrantsPlus was founded in 2007. And really what we do is we partner with nonprofits to help them be better at grant seeking, full stop. Sometimes that means we help them find opportunities. Sometimes that means we teach them how to be great grant seekers. Sometimes that means we are their grants department, but we are working with clients across the country, and really our mission is just helping them get the money they need to do their mission, and being better prepared to do their mission. So Kari, if you can flip to the next slide here. So as far as our partnership, we are so thrilled to be working with the Scranton Area Community Foundation. We work with community foundations a lot of times in sort of a similar setup here, where we are doing a webinar series to help organizations be better grant seekers and get more money for their mission. And we do that through webinars and also, like Maggie said, through coaching. So this is a little bit different. We do one-on-one sessions where you will meet with one of our grants experts. So our senior staff members, I am one of the people on that list that you could meet with. And we'll send you a link for the recording for this session, as well as how to sign up for coaching sessions. And really what those are is those are an opportunity for you to talk with the grant expert about pretty much anything, any grant problem that has been bugging you. We on these calls, we'll talk about how to find new opportunities. We'll talk about how to approach funders, how to talk about programs in ways that funders are going to be excited about funding. So really, it is come to us with your stumpers and talk to some experts and get some help. And there are signups to that. Kari, if you can flip over to the next slide. Nope. I thought that was on there. The signups for October are closed, but the signups for November, you can sign up for a session in November up until Friday, November 5th. And you can sign up and you can still sign up for a December session then too, obviously. And then the closeout for December will be December 3rd. Thank you for finding that slide, Kari. A little bit out of order here. And if you can go back to the webinars too. We also, have this series of webinars. So we're talking today about building a pipeline, and that is going to lead into a webinar in 2 weeks on transforming those prospects into funders. That's going to be a lot about relationship building. I think that one is going to be great. And then we're going to talk about telling your story in grant proposals. So not just having yet another dry proposal full of numbers and facts, but actually having your story in there. We're going to talk about how to build out a team to pursue federal grants, because we know we do a lot of federal grants, and they are work, and they are intimidating, and they are hard for one person to do. So we'll talk about building out your team for that. And then also our last webinar in December then is going to be about attracting national funders. So there are some things that you need to be and do to be competitive in federal grants. So we're going to talk about that, so you can learn how to be competitive in seeking national level funding and regional. I mean, we say national, but funding beyond your immediate zone of comfort. So we're looking forward to doing all of those. And I think that is all the pitching I have here for our work here. Please sign up for a coaching session. We hope that you are joining us for the rest of our webinars. But let's get to today's topics. So we've got a few things we're going to discuss today. First of these is why a multi-year pipeline is important. So why it's important to have a plan for grant seeking. So that will be, what the first thing we talk about. Then how to do that. And we're going to talk about doing that starting with your current funders. So it's not even intimidating, it's easy. And then we're going to talk about how to maintain a pipeline that will continue to adapt to change, because my goodness, we have all been adapting to change for the past 18 months. So we're going to talk a little bit about the resilience of that. So Kari, I am going to turn it over to you to start with the importance of the multi-year pipeline.
Thank you. And I also have a disclaimer RE video. I have some notes over here on the side. And so if it looks like I'm not looking at you, that is because I'm looking at my notes. But happy to be here with you and hope to connect on this very important topic. So the first piece of building a multi-year pipeline for grant seeking is to start where you are. Take stock of your goals for foundation fundraising, your existing relationships, any changes that might be coming down the pike for your organization, and try to get a sense of why you're asking for money. The one thing that all grant seekers have in common is that they need money. So you really need to get a good sense of what are you going to use it for, what are your needs, and what exactly will that request look like. And it's important to understand not only what you need right now, but what you anticipate needing in the future, and building that into your plans. We like to think of grant seeking as a multi-year ongoing process. And our reason is because it works. A lot of funders want to establish a relationship with you before they become a funder. They want to get to know your staff. They want to get to know your programs and your outcomes before they give you any funding. So when you take a long-term view, it's a little easier to plug funding in to fit your plans because you have that relationship with funders. You can go to them and say, this is what we need right now. And you have that track record to back you up as you make those requests. They're just more likely to invest in you as an organization when you have that bond, when you keep them updated, and we'll be talking about different ways that you can do that today. So why a pipeline matters, especially right now, we have a few reasons here. The first is that funding is likely to be more competitive. The past year and a half, of course, there's been a lot of change. A lot of organizations really took a hit, and so are going to grant makers now that they might not have approached before, or going to grant makers that maybe gave them less before, and at a time when organizations need more. So it is a competitive field out there. Also, many funders are still focused on pandemic response. There was an initial response to a crisis, and then now we're dealing still with recovery and the repercussions of that pandemic. So it may still be difficult to get into a routine as far as your funder relationships. We've even found that, like you, most likely a lot of funders are still working remotely, and it's a little harder to get in touch. And so you have to account for that in putting together your grants pipeline and some of the ripple effects of the pandemic. Finally, and this is true all the time, your work may have changed. You may have increased needs related to the pandemic or something completely unrelated. Maybe you have some new programming, or you want to expand into a new community. If you have changes that you're facing and increased needs for funding, you have new opportunities for funders and for creating a plan to approach them. So this is just a bit more here about the effect of COVID-19 and what it meant for the nonprofit sector. Just like in 2018 with economic upheaval, there's been this upheaval from the pandemic where philanthropy was looked to for a response, even as they were facing their own challenges in adapting. So we found in our work with nonprofits that those who had already had an established relationship with a funder had a much easier time getting COVID-19 related funds, getting that crisis money that they needed to bridge the pandemic. And that's because they had these long-term relationships, the funders knew them, they had lots of options as far as who to go to. And that is really important when you're really in a crunch and you need that money. And they had an easier time than those organizations who were stuck with, oh, we're in a crisis now, and now we need to find funders. And of course, for all those reasons I just discussed, including competitiveness, that's not a comfortable place to be. So continuing to talk about some of the realities of what your organization will face. Every organization needs new funding at some point. You always are changing, you're expanding, you're shifting focus. Maybe a program is reaching a new community. You could have organizational changes like new staff members to help you meet your goals. Environmental changes, maybe something in the system is different. We hear from nonprofits that we're relying on federal or state funding, and of course that can often shift. And as that landscape shifts, you may find increased need for foundation funding. And finally, inflation. Numbers go up, and so your requests will need to go up as well. So building that pipeline, again, is really important here, as those funders are partners with you as you face these realities. Another thing to keep in mind, unless you're really lucky and have grant makers that have been giving to you forever and forever will, the truth is that most of them will not fund you every year. And there's a few different reasons for that. First, they may have a formal funder policy. They may say that we aren't going to fund you 2 years in a row, or every 3 years you need to take a year off, something like that. They may only give you, you know, we work with one funder where they will only ever give you $20,000. So you can go to them twice for 10, 4 times for 5, or once for 20, and that's it. I guess you could go for 20 for $1,000 each time. But, you know, policies like that can be limiting, and just something to keep in mind. Another reason is funder fatigue. If you're asking for the same thing every year, they might not want to keep funding that. They certainly don't want to be your only source of funding for a particular program either, because then you're wholly reliant on them. And, you know, 2020 and so far 2021 have really illustrated this. A funder who has been giving to you year after year may switch focus, and, you know, that could be fatigue, or it could be a change in their priorities, but just something that happens no matter the climate. And finally, they may have a mission change or an adjustment. Sometimes a funder will take a year off to look at their strategy and then come back to you and say, oh, we're not funding that anymore, even if they funded you year over year. So that's another element to be aware of, and another reason why it's so important to have funders in your pipeline that you can go to as these changes happen. Continuing to look at some of these realities of building a pipeline, some funders really require a long-term effort. They're not necessarily going to give to you the first or even second time you apply. They might not even invite you to apply until you have a longer relationship with them. And there are a few things here that contribute to that long-term effort. First, for some funders, you may need a way in, you might need a connection, and you can mine your board and your staff for connections to a funder, either to their board or their staff. You might need to put in multiple applications to just get on their radar, to be noticed, and for them to have time to fund you. So and we'll talk about this shortly, but if they have all of their funds dedicated to a certain cause already, it might take a while for you to be able to get on that list. And you need to explore cultivation to find the right program and mission fit. We always tell our clients that they should go to a funder with really a menu of things that you can approach and you can ask for, so that if they don't like the first item on the menu, maybe they'll be more excited about the second. And it takes time to hone in on that perfect fit. And finally, there are those funders that we call aspirational. Maybe they're leaders in the field. Maybe they fund only larger organizations, but are a perfect fit in terms of your mission. There's some reason why they're not fit today, but might be a fit tomorrow. So you want to make sure that these funders, even though they require long-term effort, they're still on your radar. They're still in the pipeline, and you don't want to lose them, because, like we said, as things change, they may turn into a valuable resource for you. So all of those ongoing realities add up to this mindset that we encourage, which is a mindset for long-term success. Of course, short-term success is still really important. You have budget gaps that you need to cover one way or another. And long-term success, however, doesn't result from jumping from crisis to crisis or from budget gap to budget gap. It really is building that pipeline and moving from the idea of getting a grant to having a relationship where maybe they say no today, but not no forever. And that's really the importance of a long-term mindset in building a pipeline. The hope is that from year to year, you already have a sense of where you're going for funding before the year even starts, and some sense of whether you'll be funded or not. And it's not just a matter of, you know, like I said, jumping from budget gap to budget gap as they come up. So I'm going to turn it over to Matt now to talk about the pipeline for, you know, how to actually put this pipeline together.
Great, thank you, Kari. And I neglected to mention at the beginning, throughout our presentation here, at any point, if you have a question, please use the Q&A feature that is in your control bar here. So let's talk about the multi-year pipeline basics here. And Kari, if you can flip to the next slide. So our model is so important that it is limited by 3 dimensions. Because if you think about a pipeline, it's going to be a straight line from a prospect to a funder. And that's not the reality. So this is what I like to call the slot machine model. That's not its official name. But this is what far too many organizations do. They think about their pipeline and they say, okay, well, we have these funders who have proposals due on these days. So we're going to send a proposal into the funder and then maybe we get money. And as our bullet points will show here, that is a frustrating thing because, you know, it occasionally works. But you don't have a relationship. You have no long-term potential with that funder. You just have a series of transactions that you have done. You have put your proposal into the slot and money came out. It is not dependable. And this is why we talk about a pipeline, because this is almost literally going to the casino of nonprofit funding and putting in your coin and hoping that you win. So let's talk about what the pipeline really looks like, which is, again, limited by 3 dimensions, is not a straight line. So what we're talking about here is this full grant cycle. So for any of you who've done individual giving, this should look really familiar. And this cycle is a relationship-based cycle, just like dealing with individuals. It is based on having long-term relationships. It's based on having ongoing communication. And this is what you need the pipeline for. You have to keep track of all of this. So this first thing on top, the strategy and readiness, is what Kari was talking about knowing what you need funding for, knowing maybe upcoming what you need funding for. It is then identifying funders and putting them in your pipeline. So these are the funders that you've looked at and you've maybe looked in Foundation Directory, you've looked at some of the other organizations that are similar to you, and these are those funders that you say, hey, they're funding people who are doing work like we do. They're probably a good funder for us. So they end up in the pipeline. You then have to move on to cultivation. And this is where you build that relationship. This is where you talk with funders. And we'll talk about this a lot in 2 weeks. This is where you build those relationships with funders that make all the difference. And then finally, you get to the ask. So at 6 o'clock here, we started our circle at midnight. At 6 o'clock, you're finally making the ask. And that is obviously an important part of the pipeline too, because funders have deadlines and they want their asks when they want them. But that is, again, just part of the pipeline. It is not the sole focus. And then obviously, if you get funded, you've got to do the funded work and move on to stewardship and make sure you're thanking the funder and all of that stuff. And then you start it all over again. So you need a pipeline to keep track of this. Kari, if you can flip to our next one here. And what I'm talking about here is not anything overly complicated. It is really just a multi-year plan that lets you keep track of everything you've got to submit, everything you'd like to submit, and the funders that you would like to grow relationships with. So obviously, you start this with your current funders because you need to keep working with them. You need to give them their stewardship reports, and you need to know when you are submitting for the next cycle and talk with them about what you should submit for and all of that. And then you need to work in your potential funders, and we'll talk about these a little more. Then you need to work in your potential funders. So you start with your current funders, build your skeleton on that because you know when everything's going to happen with them. Then the potential funders come in, the ones that you want to develop those relationships with. And you put them in for knowing, hey, if we want to go for the July deadline, we need to make sure we've talked to this funder by May, and they know this proposal is coming, all of that. You also need a place for your aspirational funders. And these are the ones that Kari was talking about, the ones that might fund you someday. So, right now your program is too small to get their attention, or right now your program is only focused on pre-K, but you know that they only care about K-8, but you know that someday you're going to have a K-8 program. So you want a place where they are not going to get lost. And if they don't live someplace for real on a pipeline, you're going to lose them. So this is really containing everyone you know that you're going to have to work with, every funder that you would like to work with, and then funders that you would someday like to work with. And it really is just as simple as a method for keeping track of all of that. So what do you need in your pipeline? I mean, in the end, what this is your plan to bring in funding to do what you do as an organization. So you need to make sure that whatever is in your pipeline is going to meet your needs. And this is kind of where a budget and a pipeline come together. So, if your organizational budget for next year says, you know, you need to bring in $100,000 in grant funding, your pipeline is your roadmap to get there. And you need to make sure that you are bringing in enough renewal funders and enough new funders that you're going to be able to meet that goal while assuming you've got some turnover. So for example, if I'm working with a client and I know that they need $100,000 in grants for a program, and that program got $80,000 in grants last year, but it's going to expand a little bit, I'm probably going to make sure that their pipeline includes maybe 150,000 or maybe even a little bit more in potential grants for that program, so that we know that we have it covered if, you know, one of their current funders decides to not fund, if we are wrong about a potential funder's interest, et cetera. We want to make sure we've got enough to cover that. The other thing is that the pipeline has to be achievable. This is not some way to math your way out of reality. You know, if you can't say, well, we raised $100,000 last year, so next year let's do $200,000 and let's just throw a bunch of funders on here so our math equals, you know, we might be able to raise $200,000 and call it a day. You can include some stretch goals in here, but it needs to be realistic. You know, it also has to be possible with your resources. Part of that realistic is not just will they fund us, but part of that realistic is, do we have the resources to write enough grants or to have enough relationships that we're actually able to pull this off? So, you know, it can't be, well, we're going to write 50 federal grants with our staff of 2 to bring in enough money for our programs. That is not a realistic pipeline. The other thing too, that is the last point on here, is that this is never a finished document. You know, if you print it out, whatever format you're using, it's going to be full of arrows and crossouts and highlights and all of that within weeks, if not days. It needs to evolve to meet your changing realities and the changing realities of the world. So really what we're talking about here is a place to basically store all of the knowledge you need to be successful. So if we look at the next slide, the mechanics are basically use what works best for you. So it needs to have a calendar where you know when you're submitting things, when your reports are due, cultivation reminders. Like I said, if you know you're going to submit for a June or a July deadline, you definitely want to have talked to that funder by May. So you've got some time to play phone tag and all of that fun. And any other key milestones that are on there, whatever that means to you. So if that is, you know, if our new program is going to launch in July, that will then enable us to get new funding. Make sure that is on your pipeline with a big exclamation point so that you know that's happening. You also want to make sure that you've got your grant funding goals by year and ideally by program, so that you're able to track and know that you are building out this plan that's going to get you the funding you need, like we talked about. You also want to make sure there is some clearly identified cultivation and submission status. So that means knowing which funders you're in the cultivation process with, which ones you can submit to, et cetera. And that can be, I'm going to show you I've got a client that uses this super simple Excel sheet that I didn't necessarily trust, and I should have trusted because it's simple and great. But just having a clearly identified place where you know what the status is for that funder. And then also just having a place to park those aspirational funders. And, you know, for my client that I was just talking about that does this in Excel, they just have a tab that is not now. And that's funders they don't want to lose track of. And I think, you know, they go back and look at them probably quarterly. I look at them a little more often than that, but that is just funders that they have parked and don't want to lose. So let's look at that sheet really quickly. The next slide here, it is a super simple example from this year's. Obviously, I have changed the names of the funders to protect the innocent. But if you look, all this is, it just says who the funder is, what their relationship is. So the first one was a past funder who is not currently funding them. The other one is a renewal. The other one is a prospect. So that's a funder that they would like to get funding from, but has not funded them yet. And then the lovely fund, the last one there, is someone that they have talked to, but they're still stewarding. They know that they need to do you know, some more work before they're able to apply for the next grant. So you look, it's got, like I said, name, relationship, the work month, when this stuff needs to get done. It has a submission deadline, so that is when the grant is due. That's what the funder sets. It has an outreach deadline, which is that internal. So if you look at the first one, if we want to submit for March 15th, we have got to have had some outreach with them by the end of January. And then knowing what the program is, so these are all for their school programming, what the request will be, and then just some tracking at the end. So, when it was submitted, what the status is, if they were awarded, if there's a report due, and all of that. But what you'll see here is if you look at the very bottom of the slide, there's that education grant funding budget. So that is $125,000. They know that they need for their education program $125,000 in grants. And if you look at their total potential from this list, they've got a nice 132,500. So they're probably going to be able to do that. And it seems pretty tight until you see that the Lovely Fund, they don't have a request amount on because they're not sure what their next request is going to be on that. So you just this simple Excel sheet, doing this will help you be, if you don't have something like this right now, will help you be a better fundraiser just by keeping track of all the moving parts and what has to go and when, and matching up your current funders with your potential funders and all of that. So we're not even talking about anything complicated necessary. It's just having a place where all of this lives. So with that, I am actually going to launch a poll here before we move it over to Kari for our next section. So you should all be able to see this in a second. And this is just kind of following up. Do any of you use any of the following? And that is, it's a multiple choice. So if you use more than one, you can click more than one. We've got some votes coming in. We're going to give this about another 30 seconds. All right, this is good. We've got 10 more seconds here. We've got 60% of you have answered. 70% of you have answered. Okay, we're going to end that. So this is actually not terribly surprising. You should be able to see these now. Pretty much everybody has some kind of plan. So, for the 11% of you that don't, I hope that we have talked you into this. 83% of you have got a reporting plan. So that's great. You never want to lose track of reports. And funders are always very understanding if you can't make the reporting deadline or you need an extra month to do something to get your numbers or whatever, but you've got to have that on your calendar to do that. But we drop off a lot on a cultivation calendar for your recent funders or for your past funders and for your new potential funders. And one of the reasons that we talk about pipelining a lot with our clients, and one of the reasons that we have this webinar, is because that is important. That's as important as the other stuff. You have got to keep that pipeline going and have new funders to replace funders that drop off. So having some kind of place where they are written down and attached to a deadline makes a huge difference. Otherwise, it's just something, when I have time, I will look for new funders. When I have time, I will call this funder. And there's never time. We work in the nonprofit sector. There's never, ever time. So unless you've got a date associated with it and you can hold yourself accountable for it, you're not going to do that. So for the overwhelming majority of you that are not keeping a calendar or any kind of tracking on that, I hope that one of the results of our webinar here is that you start incorporating prospects, whether that is cultivating new funders or making sure that you are talking to your current or recent past funders that into your calendar. So let me stop sharing that. And Kari, I'm going to flip this over to you in a second. We've got a question here. And the question here is, I've worked with Microsoft Access to build grant pipelines in the past. Are there any systems similar or better that can assist in your pipeline? So I think that was before I showed that glorious Excel sheet. But the answer is really, if Access is working for you, keep going with that. If Excel would work better for you, go with that. If keeping this, if you are one of those lucky few whose brain works like a database works and you want to use your Donor Perfect or your Razor's Edge or whatever you've got to do this, that works too. It is really whatever works, whatever is going to work for you, and actually make sure that you're getting this stuff done. So Kari, with that, I'm going to flip this back over to you.
Thanks. So we have talked about the why of a pipeline and the what of a pipeline, the basics of putting it together. And now we want to talk about actually building that pipeline. So the spine of the pipeline, the starting point, is always the renewal calendar for this year and next year. So starting again with what you've already got. We like to suggest 2 years because it's a more meaningful chunk of time, allows you to look forward a little bit and not just focus on this year, and potentially get lost on funders that may decline you this year, but may be a prospect for next year. So it just helps you have a longer range view. One thing that's important to remember is that the submission dates may have changed since last year. So you want to make sure that you're current with when you need to submit your application, and of course any reports as well. We also like to remember that there is capacity and capacity challenges nonprofits, and that can change from year to year as well. So make sure that your plan is doable, is achievable, like Matt said before. And just, you know, if you are a development department of 1, what does that mean for you this year? If you're a department of 10, what does that mean for you this year and next year? And finally, don't just think about the due date. You saw on the spreadsheet that there were lots of dates in there, including, again, reporting, cultivation, when you're expecting the award to come in. And so building that all into your pipeline, it's not just about the due date. I want to talk now about building that plan. So the best pipeline prioritizes funders based on a number of factors, and those are capacity, again, deadlines, and openness. So we suggest starting with the largest funders, where you get the most bang for your buck in terms of the time that you spend. I'm sure there are many of you who can think of smaller funders with capacity to give only a smaller grant, but the application is no easier. Our recommendation is, if you have limited capacity and limited time, go for those larger dollars. Of course, deadlines are another element of the pipeline here. You want to prioritize those, obviously, who have the deadlines coming up first. Now, many of them do have multiple deadlines, which allows you to line up your process with, you know, your programming timelines and your capacity. If you have more time in June or July to start to apply for things, then maybe you want to build around those months. But it's important, of course, to remember the deadline and to make sure that you don't miss any by not prioritizing those that have the deadline coming up. And finally, openness to grantees. So you may want to prioritize, especially with funders where you don't have an existing or a very strong relationship, prioritizing those funders that have an open process. They're open to you reaching out beforehand. Maybe they have a short LOI, letter of intent or letter of inquiry that you can submit beforehand, just to see if they're open to a discussion or open to your request. And we really like when that happens, because even if you get a no, at least you didn't waste your time building out an application. And you can also learn, you know, is it a no right now? Is it a no forever? And just getting more information before you put that time into an application. The next piece, and we actually started the entire presentation off with this, is by starting with making sure those current funders are optimized. One question you always want to ask is, are you getting what you should be? Just because a funder has given you $10,000 year after year doesn't mean that they don't have the capacity to give more. So you may want to look at what other grantees are getting. Are you around average for them, especially, you know, taking into account the size of your organization? Could it be that you could get more money from this funder? Of course, if your needs dictate that. Another question when you're looking at your current funders is are you at risk of burning out your current funders? How long have they been funding you? What is your sense in talking to them about how they feel about your programs and the relationship that they've built out with you? Another thing to keep in mind is that you may not still be part of their core mission. Like I said before, missions do change, funders do change strategies, and that could mean that you as an organization might get left behind. You want to try to pay attention to this as an element of your conversations with the funder, because again, you don't want to be left behind without having any sense that that might happen. And here the suggestion is that you really audit, what we call audit, your current and recent grants. And again, getting what you should be from the funder. Are you asking for the same amount for the same program every year? Organizations can be afraid of rocking the boat. They don't want to take new programs or new needs or even changes to the funder because they don't want to upset that relationship. Of course, we do not suggest that. A recommendation is to always be transparent. You want to make sure that they know what's going on with you as an organization, and the fact that you have been building this relationship with them only makes it that much easier to talk about those changes. And finally, you want to make sure that you're discussing requests before you make them. And this is especially true with a brand new funder where you don't have that existing relationship. You want to talk about the request beforehand, make sure it's aligned with what they do. And in this case, you know, in terms of the amount of their request, making sure that the amount is in line with what they do. So in looking at these questions and auditing your asks, you can try to determine, are you getting what you should be from this funder? As far as the issue of burning out the current funders, maybe they're giving you grants that are beyond their limitations. So if you look at what they're giving other grantees and see that you're near the top, they might be thinking about how they can back away a bit from that investment to make room for new grantees. It could be that you're getting funding from a legacy priority. So maybe they once really cared about art therapy, but you find that more and more they're focused on other things, and they may, you know, be shifting. Another risk is that you're turning in the same proposal basically in the same report every year. So are you, as you're getting this funding, what is changing about your nonprofit? Are you growing? Are you seeing new and better outcomes? Make sure that your proposals and your reports reflect that. And also, you know, are there new challenges, things that the funder needs to know that shows that you as an organization are not on autopilot? And again, if some or all of these apply, you may no longer be a priority to a funder, or they may be set up to be giving you less money than they have in the past. Final part of the audit is, you know, are these real relationships with your current funders, or is it, like Matt said, the slot machine? So you want to think about what your interactions look like with this funder. Just as in the case with good friends or family members, you don't want to just go to them when you need money, right? You want to keep them apprised of what you're doing, you know, as often as possible without, you know, badgering them. So things that you could do could be adding a funder to your listserv, to your mailing list, sending them your annual report, and letting funders know when there have been changes to your programming, especially if it affects a grant that they've given you. So have things expanded? Have you faced a challenge that you weren't expecting? These are things that you can do to establish that real relationship. One sign that it's not working is maybe the funder is not picking up the phone, answering your emails quickly. It could be that the relationship is not a priority to them. And so you can take those steps to build that up. So after looking at the current funders and auditing where you are with them, you need to think about planning for program growth. So like we said, we recommend that 2-year timeline, and building your program plans into that is really important. So you're always looking to be able to fund your future needs without by having them in mind today. So planning right now for tomorrow. This will let you talk about not only, you know, what we need to pay the bills right now, but what we're doing in the future and how that funder fits into your needs. And this speaks back to how we talked about really understanding your organization before you go to a funder. So this also gives you a chance to to assign a place for those aspirational funders that Matt was talking about. It gives you kind of a parking lot for funders that aren't a fit today, but you still want to keep on your radar. And this practice really encourages that long-term mindset that we talked about before. So the next piece of building your pipeline is research. And this is actually the area that I focus most on in my work with GrantsPlus. And I know how important it can be after you have all your ducks in a row as far as your current funders is researching. So not only researching and making sure you're up to date on your current funders, deadlines, priority changes, but also making sure you set aside time to look into new funders. So setting aside that research time, maybe it's an hour or two every month, maybe it's every quarter. The goal is to look for grant makers whose priorities are reflected in your work. So a funder may publish or have a website that lists their mission. You may be able to look on their website for a list of past grantees. You can look on their 990 to see who they've supported. The thing to keep in mind is that the funders are there to support your mission, not your organization. So you don't want to talk about in your proposal, if you get to that point, why your organization needs the money. You want to talk about what you do with the money and how that aligns with their goals as well as your own. And we recommend looking at grant makers that fund those people, those causes, and using that as a gauge to see whether or not the funder is in line with what you want to do. And finally, again, a reminder here that make sure those current funders are correctly represented in the pipeline in terms of the request amount, the mission, and the deadlines. So we recommend, like I said, ongoing research every once in a while, making sure that you go and look into new funders. And that's another way to make sure that you're not left in the lurch when a funder may drop you off their list for whatever reason, or may decline funding, or may decrease funding. Making sure that you have new funders in the pipeline is really important to avoiding an instance where that happens and you have nowhere to turn for that funding that you were once reliant on. Another thing to keep in mind right now, at least, is that some funders are still in that response mode for COVID-19 and pandemic, and racial justice is another thing that really came to the forefront in the last year and a half. These are all changes that are real and that many funders have shifted to accommodate. So you want to make sure that those changes are not affecting your plans. And another reason to make sure that you are researching those new funders if they have. Next, we want to talk a bit about the focus of building a pipeline. So we already talked about investing in those funders that have supported you in the past, making sure that you cultivate those relationships. They really should be the most important to you. Then make sure you spend time on those funders that are an obvious match with your work. Sometimes we'll come across a funder that for some reason sticks out, but isn't that great of a match. You don't want to sink a lot of your time into those funders, even if you have a relationship that you think is going to pan out. Prioritize those funders that are a match in terms of the work that you're doing. The research that you do will probably yield quite a few results. So that and these other tips here will help you to hone in on those best prospects. Another important thing is to prioritize, especially if you have limited capacity, prioritize those foundations that have a clear submission process. If their website is really just a placeholder with their name and address, that might not be the best place to start with a new funder. Look for those funders that make it very clear how to apply. Another way to determine if this funder is a good fit is to see if they're open to talking with potential new grantees. One way to tell this is, how much information is posted on their website. Is there a name and a phone number and an email address? On the opposite end of the spectrum, does it say, don't contact us, just send in your application? And we see that as well. If that's the case and you have that limited capacity, don't prioritize those funders. Make sure you focus on those where you can get a better sense going in as to whether they will fund you or not. And finally here, I really like this graphic. Pipelines work for everyone. And Matt showed before this, the spreadsheet that's really simple. Anybody can put it together. Even a small busy staff can make this pipeline work. And Matt has an example here of how an organization can do that.
Yeah, do I get to tell this one?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is actually one of my clients. It's a human service provider. They've got a 2-person fundraising staff that also does government relations and marketing, is in charge of their website, and also does grant reporting, and also is in charge of working with finance to make sure grants are being spent correctly. If our cameras were on, I think some of you would be nodding. So their grant seeking had always sort of just been the funders that have funded them in the past, and maybe if they saw something, they would go for it. And they were not getting a lot of grant money. So they committed to developing a pipeline, and we came in and helped them with that. They committed to coming up with, here is a realistic pipeline for us. We are a 2-person staff. We are never going to be submitting 5 proposals a month. Let's look at what our most important, maybe 12 to 20 are for the year, and we'll get those in. And they most important thing they did was they wrote it down. They made it was, I think it was in Word, it was like bullet points, but whatever. They had a plan, they had dates attached to them, they worked the plan, and they doubled to almost tripled their grant funding. And that was not because they had some major change, it was just because they had committed to actually doing it and had a pipeline that made deadlines real and made funding real, and not something they would get to when the crisis was over, because the crisis is never over. That is one of the things that we have heard from every single client we've ever had. There's always something. So we talk a lot about making sure that you're still working through your funding during the crisis, because if you don't have funding, then that just creates a whole new crisis. So with that, I am going to launch one more poll for us and then talk a little bit about tending your pipeline once you've got it. So this is a poll about how often you check in on your current funders, your grant funders, about their mission, their priorities, and look at their grant making to other organizations to make sure that you're getting what you should be getting. And we've got a couple people in. We're going to give this about 20 more seconds. Okay, we're going to give this about 10 more seconds. We've got a good mix here. All right, 2 more seconds. Okay, so an interesting mix on this one. A lot of times we get a big focus on I generally don't, and whenever I hear something that may have changed. And that's only 60% of this poll together. Usually that's more like 80. So you guys are a little bit ahead of the curve. For those of you who say every time we think about submitting, we check in on them, yes, that is the correct answer in this poll, if there is a correct answer. Make sure that you are aware of any tweaks the funder has made, whether that's to process, whether that's to mission, because that lets you tell your story and about how you're going to advance their mission in a better way. So for those of you, whenever something makes me think about it, that's also pretty good. That's better than most people. But for those of you who are not doing that, we recommend just take the 2 minutes. We're going to talk a little more in the next session about why the relationship is important. So you're going to be calling them anyway. So make sure that you are checking in on that and their priorities. So we're going to end up today. I've just got a couple slides here talking about tending. So we talked about why it's important. Kari talked about how you actually go about building out your pipeline. So I'm going to talk about tending it. So Kari, if you can flip over to our next slide here. This is, like I said earlier, this is not a static document. This is something that is going to require regular tending. And that might be because your needs have changed. And we have seen a lot of that in the past 2 years. And I'm so sick of talking about the past 2 years that I can't wait till it's 5 years from now and I don't have to talk about it anymore. But a lot of organizations' needs have changed. Some funder focus areas have changed, and luckily not a ton under COVID. But there is, if you have got a list of 20 funders you are going to regularly, at least every other year, probably one of them is going to have some focus change. They may have deadlines that have changed. They may have policies that have changed. They may now have an online application and you've always sent in a paper one. So just these things like this, making sure that you're keeping up on what's going on, making sure that you're refreshing your pipeline. And a lot of that can be done by just having a relationship with funders. So, you know, everything I've talked about, if you are giving a 10-minute call 2 months before you're going to submit again for one of your current funders, all of that would have been handled. So, you know, there is definitely the relationship covers up for a lot of this. Also, you still need to make sure that you're planning. So, you know, we say the perfect plan in December is rarely perfect in June. So again, there might be some changes on your end. The program might have different needs. Funders might have new submission plans or new deadlines. You know, the best planned programming still changes. And there may be some funders that were not high on the priority list, and your reality hits of, you know, we just don't have time to deal with these, and they drop off. They go from we are going to submit in January to let's go to their June deadline, or let's put them on the list for next year to cultivate. That's not going to happen this year. So really what this comes down to is you've got to be able to connect with your funders. And this is your segue into our session in 2 weeks. A lot of your pipeline exists so that you will be able to connect with funders and work through your pipeline. So that is discussing your plans with them well before deadlines. That is making sure your funders know what's going on with your programming, your organization. And it really is building relationships that lead to a years-long mindset. Because what this really all leads to is that we are not talking about getting the next grant next month. We are talking about developing a relationship with funders that is going to get you 10 years of grants. And maybe that's not the same grant every year, and maybe there's time off, and maybe it's going to take some time to get to that. But we are talking about long-term success, not about what's going to get you the quick hit for the next deadline. So having said all that, let me just review our top. We've gotten that one through. You know, the how-to is whatever is going to work best with you, building on a skeleton of your current funders. And the how to maintain that pipeline is making sure that you are keeping up on it, because there are going to be changes in your organization and changes in the funders that will need to be addressed. So that is our topic for today. We are unfortunately right at time. I do want to throw up a quick slide again with a reminder about our next topic.
Hi, this is Kari again. It looks like Matt froze here. I'm sure he just wanted to wrap up by saying that these webinars are coming up and that we invite you to attend as your schedule allows. If you have any questions, you can always feel free to reach out to us at GrantsPlus, and you saw at the beginning our website and information to reach us. And we look forward to seeing you soon. I have up here the deadlines for signing up for coaching. And Matt, you're back if you have any final,
I am.
final words.
That was neat. My internet just turned off for 30 seconds. So no, thank you all for joining us. Maggie, again, thanks for having us. We love this partnership, and I hope that we're going to see most of you in coaching sessions and in our future webinars.
Thank you both. And hope you all have a great
Thank you.
day.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.